We are all experiencing, as part of this war in Ukraine, this war between Ukraine, Russia and NATO, bombardment of narratives about the war. And in my previous video, my previous episode, I talked about how to stay sane amongst all those competing narratives. True freedom of mind, peace of mind, is found by paying attention to the truths of the alternative histories and stories about the war out there. There's truth in all the different stories. There's also falsehood. So in this episode, I'm going to outline 6 narratives, 6 short histories of the Ukraine war. And my aim is to show that there are many ways of telling the story of this conflict, and each illuminates some truths while hiding other truths in the shadows and silences of its story. And only by paying attention to all these different stories can we find our way back to dialogue and diplomacy. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about 6 common histories that are embedded in the narrative and the news stories and the coverage of the Russia-Ukraine war. Some of those stories are pro-Ukraine, some of those stories are pro-Russia. And when I say they're histories, I mean they're like the pictures for a movie, the sort of basic plot line of the stories that people are telling when they're recounting the histories of the Ukraine war. Now, some scholars and writers have gone to the trouble of elaborating these basic ideas into, extensive studies of the history of this war, or the history of Ukraine, the history of Russia. But all I'm really trying to convey in this episode or video is the gist of the different ideas that are talked about, so that you, as a viewer, as an ordinary citizen trying to make sense of this war, can find your way through the bombardment of narratives about the war. If you haven't listened to this podcast or watched this YouTube channel before, my name is Jeff Rich, and this is the Burning Archive YouTube channel. I'm a historian, writer, and a retired government official, and I'm trying to tell stories about the multipolar world, and also how the history, the past, still makes itself felt in today's world. The past is not dead. The past is not even past. So 6 different stories about 6 common histories or stories about the Russia-Ukraine-NATO war. That's what I'm going to do today, and look what the basic idea of the story is, who some of the best proponents of that story are, but also what some of its truths and some of its shadows, its shadow side are, where it perhaps goes astray. And the aim is not to say one or other of these stories is right, but just to bring to everyone's attention that there are many different ways of seeing this conflict, and we should all do our best to understand all of these perspectives. And I'm going to do a second video, which will be out in a couple of days, which is looking at 6 more versions of this story. 6 less common versions, including 3 eccentric individual historical interpretations that I've devised myself and previously discussed on the podcast. Okay, so the 6 histories, the 6 stories, the 6 pictures about the Russia-Ukraine-Russian war are: number 1, Ukraine's struggle for national independence. The story that is told when people say Slava Ukrainia or I stand with Ukraine. Number 2, 2 is the Ukraine Civil War. Russia had a terrible civil war between 1917, 1918 and 1922, in which millions of people died, and perhaps there's characteristics of that war that can also be seen in this current war. The third storyline is democracy versus autocracy. This is the latest episode in the ongoing Marvel series from the United States, retelling the story of America's victorious fight for democracy in World War II against the autocrats of the world, in which Volodymyr Zelensky is the freedom fighter. The fourth story, and I'm putting all of these stories in not super serious terms. The fourth story is Cold War II, and the fifth version of the story is the anti-Russia war. The anti-Russia war based in Ukraine, that some people unkindly call State 404. And then finally, the Russian Empire strikes back. So I'm going to cover each of those 6 stories now. Ukraine's struggle for national independence, Slava Ukrainia. This is a phrase, glory to Ukraine, that is commonly closes the speeches of Volodymyr Zelensky, and I must say I instinctively shudder just a little bit whenever I hear a political leader say glory to their nation, but I will put that aside and try to present this basic argument. So the idea is essentially that Ukraine is, in a way, one of the heartland Slavic nations, and it has always been its own nation, but it's been heavily repressed, first by the Russian Empire, then by the Soviet Union, and then by post-1991 Russia, the Russian Federation. And that it is by joining the EU, joining NATO, that Ukraine can come into its true national identity, cleansed of Russian influences, and speak as a true Ukrainian nation and state. This is the core story of many of the nationalist political leaders in Ukraine today. It's the core story that lies behind, I guess, I Stand With Ukraine movement. And it is perhaps finds its best proponent in the historian Sergei Plokhy, whose book here you can see, I hope, whose written a number of books that set out, I guess, the broad history of Ukraine's struggle to find true nationhood and how that threatens the Russian Empire, the Russian elites, and so forth. The book I just showed you there, Lost Kingdom, is the one that I have. He's also written a book called The Gates of Europe, and he's a very active advocate of this sort of argument. But it's also fundamentally the argument that you will hear largely, or the story, the narrative that you hear largely in the Western media, which is that Ukraine is, the David who's fighting the Goliath, who's bullied it next door. This story that Ukraine is the David fighting the bully Goliath is you see played out in more or less sophisticated forms in, real historians' commentary. It's kind of the story Dominic Sandbrook and Tom Holland told in the Rest is History podcast episodes on Ukraine, where they celebrated the always heroic story of Ukrainian nationhood, perhaps overlooking some of its darker past, which perhaps one day I'll do another episode of the podcast on. But it's also the story that comes through in Serhii Plokhy's books. Now, I haven't read The Gates of Europe, his history of Ukraine, but Lost Kingdom is, if you like, the other side of the ledger. It's the story of the growth of, the struggle for Ukrainian national independence, national culture and national identity against the domination of both Polish and Russian elites. And it really sort of begins all the way back in, medieval Kiev, rather simplifying things and saying that this is the birth of the true East Slavic identity of Ukraine and Ukrainian Galicia especially. And that the Russians, first through Muscovy, also through the Mongols, and also later through the Russian Empire, expropriated this Ukrainian culture to themselves, but with a guilty conscience, and that Poland and Russia sort of divided up the true nation of Ukraine, deprived it of its yearning for freedom through the Cossacks and the sort of, Ukrainian church, and suppressed the growing nationalism of Ukraine through the 19th century, the movement amongst its intellectuals to develop a Ukrainian language, a Ukrainian literature, a Ukrainian history. And then in the wake of the collapse of the Russian imperial state in 1917 and the sort of Versailles Conference of 1919, the attempts by these Ukrainian nationalists to set up a free Ukrainian state were betrayed by Western powers and the very complicated politics of Ukraine amidst the Russian Civil War, in which I think there were in a year there were 5 different claimants on the state of Ukraine. Sort of set things back, and then there were 80 years of sort of repressive tolerance of Ukrainian identity through the Soviet Union, which ultimately broke and cracked, and the role of Ukrainian leaders in destroying the Soviet Union is celebrated as the natural expression of national Ukrainian identity, more European than those suspect Eurasian Russians, and then ultimately over the 30 years since the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian state keeps moving closer to the West and closer to realizing its true national identity. So that's the kind of historical story of this, and in a way, it justifies, I guess, some of the aggression of the nationalist politicians in Ukraine towards the Russian-affiliated citizens, sadly. Now, there are certainly some truths to this story. There's a very complex little brother, big brother relationship, if you like. I don't mean that to be patronising in any way, but Ukraine is a smaller state, a smaller country, a smaller population, a smaller culture, in terms of its world impact than Russia. Very complex little brother, big brother relationship in Ukraine. And, there have certainly been parts of Ukraine that have actively pursued this, this strong, separate sense of national identity. But I guess the shadows in this story is that it really doesn't recognise the multiple ethnic, cultural identities of Ukraine. It doesn't really recognise the strong Russian presence, the settlement by Russians of Novorossiya and the Donbass sort of area, the long relationship between Crimea and Russia, the many centuries of war between Ukrainians and the Tatars of Crimea, and also perhaps the rather dark history of Ukrainians' relationship to its once large Jewish population. So, I think even though it is very much the dominant narrative, I think this version of the story needs to be balanced out with some other understandings. And one in particular that does pick up that complex set of multiple identities and multiple cultural affiliations and the very fragmentary nature of the history of political institutions in Ukraine, effective democratic political institutions in Ukraine, is the version of the story that really says this is the outgrowth of a Ukrainian civil war, that a civil war, an internal political, social conflict, cultural conflict within the boundaries of Ukraine has polarized, become militarized, and spilled out to draw in, for both tactical advantage and purposes of alliance, other powers, including America, obviously, the EU, and Russia. So the second major story is to see this war as the internationalized phase of the Ukrainian Civil War. So this version of the story emphasizes, there really has been a civil war in Ukraine, like an actual kinetic civil war in Ukraine since 2014, with fighting in the Donbass, separatist republics, all that sort of thing. And it, at a deeper level, also talks about how for 150 years in this argument, there have been different ideas of what the Ukrainian nation could be, and they reflect both the different historical, geographical, social, cultural, ethnic makeup of this very diverse and very large country. In essence, the area to the east of Ukraine, including the area around Donbass, is predominantly Russian, predominantly Orthodox. The area to the west is more influenced by the kind of quasi-Catholic Uniate Church, Polish influences, and more Ukrainian speaking. And the nature of those differences is quite clear on maps and on voting intentions, for example, around referendums and that sort of thing. Just this map, for example, which I take from Restless Empire, a historical atlas of Russian history, it shows the composition, I guess, of Ukrainian versus Russian speakers in Ukraine. Ukrainian versus Russian speakers in Ukraine, largely Russian to the east and even around Kiev, and largely Ukrainian in the sort of central and western parts. And to some degree, the most extreme nationalist, anti-Russian, pro-Western views tend to come from the sort of Galicia region, around about Lvov, being much more integrated with Poland and Austria-Hungary, and I guess that part of the world rather than Russia over centuries. And it's from that area that Stepan Bandera and others sort of emerged. Even in Samuel Huntington's famous 1990s book, The Clash of Civilizations, he identifies Ukraine as a kind of a fault, what he describes as a fault line state or a cleft nation, which is at on the edges, on the borderlands between one civilizational zone, which he described as the Orthodox Russian world, and another, which he described as, Western Europe. And he had a whole little section in that book where he talked about the prospects for endemic civil conflict within Ukraine, potentially then bursting out and becoming the basis for new conflict between Russia and the United States of America. And perhaps the best proponent of the view of this history of the Ukraine conflict as a kind of civil war is Nikolai Petro, whose book The Tragedy of Ukraine, What Classical Greek Tragedy Can Teach Us About Conflict Resolution, really discusses this entire process. If you can't get access or can't meet the rather hefty price of Nikolai Petro's book there, he's done a couple of interviews, including a tremendous interview with Glenn Deason and Alexander Mercouris that I think is available on both Glenn Deason's YouTube channel and the Duran's YouTube channel, where he talks about the nature of these conflicts. And he very much talks about the tragedy of the failure, I guess, of the political elites within Ukraine to come to a civil accommodation between the various different national identities and find some form of, I guess, federated republic where people of different views and different cultural affiliations could actually work together. Ultimately, things have become more polarized and have led to this terrible struggle, which has seen, many people die over the last 8 years, and especially over the last year. And this version of the story has really some important truths, that this is the conflict in Ukraine has its engine and its origins and it starts not just in great power conflict or geopolitical strategies in Washington, but in the internal conflicts and divisions within Ukraine itself, its own internal capacity for governance and resolution of difference within them. And that there are real differences within Ukraine, that it is perhaps a democracy, but as yet not a terribly successful, tolerant, federated democracy. And but the story also has some shadows. It doesn't really account for the involvement of the great powers of the United States, the EU, Britain, and Russia in this conflict, and it perhaps overstates the role of ideas in and different senses of national identity and a trust in the capacity for tolerance and virtuous political conduct to resolve deep conflicts between identity and interests. So that's story number 2. Story number 3 is that this conflict is a conflict between democracy and autocracy, that this is Vladimir Putin's war of aggression, that this is a rerun of 1938 all over again, and that America, leading the United Democratic Nations of the world, is standing up for brave democratic Ukraine against the evil autocracies of the world like Russia and China, that Vladimir Zelensky is a freedom fighter, as I believe Sean Penn described him at the Golden Globe Awards. And this version of the story is soaked into so much of the American rhetoric about this conflict in Ukraine being a life and death struggle for the liberal rules-based orders, it being part of a great conflict between democracies and autocracies. In a way, it's another case of World War II happening all over again. And this kind of idea, this kind of story is very much, put out, supports and drives and justifies the advocacy by so many American leaders of regime change in Russia. It's the kind of idea put in the infamous RAND report from 2017, maybe 2019, that talked about weakening Russia through a conflict in Ukraine that would undermine Putin, break up Russia, enable the free development of market economies and liberal democracy in the post-Russian states, just as, it was partly achieved in the post-Soviet states, and hence turn Russia from a partner and ally with that other autocracy and competitor to the American empire, China, into a balkanized, new place for American companies to develop and extract resources from. And, a typical proponent of this kind of view is the former American ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, But it's also very much the view expressed by Sean Penn in that speech at the Golden Globe Awards, where he introduced and praised Volodymyr Zelensky. And there are some truths in this view. Clearly, you probably gather from my tone that I've got some skepticism about this view, but there are some truths in this view, in that there is a war of ideas, I guess, between the different great powers of the world at the moment around ideas of democracy and ideas of autocracy. Yeah, towards the end of 2021, Russia and China jointly released a paper on new concepts of democracy, challenging the Western view that they were not democracies, that only Western liberal democracies are true democracies. And this is a constant theme, I guess, in Chinese rhetoric. So this version of the story is a powerful one, I guess, and it draws people into the emotions very much of the war, because I guess everyone wants to be on the side of democracy and not on the side of autocracy. But I guess you'd have to question, in reality, whether, this is a world of good and evil, whether this is really another American Marvel TV series, whether this is really a conflict with the same moral clarity of World War II all over again. I guess the other big shadow around this version of the story is it simply fails to account for some of the weaknesses, let's say, of Ukraine as a democracy. Some of those very facts that are brought out by Nikolai Petro about its failures to actually civilly resolve conflict within its own political order, and its polarization of the conflict and engagement of external powers to fight a war against internal enemies. So the fourth story, little history version of this Ukraine conflict, that this is an episode in Cold War II. Now, this, I guess, this idea of Cold War II has been put about especially by the American British historian, or perhaps I should describe him as American Scottish historian, Neil Ferguson, who's also quite close to Henry Kissinger, has written a biography of Henry Kissinger, and he was certainly arguing that in the lead up to the Russia-Ukraine war, that the world is entering a phase of Cold War II. But perhaps more focused on the conflict between America and China for global leadership, or at least the terms, the rules of the world order, and less focused on Russia. But certainly seeing Russia and China as ideological allies on one side of this new struggle. And I guess one of the features of the conflict that this certainly brings out well is the ideological competition, the culture war, the information war, the multi-dimensional nature of this war, the sense in which it's about not just what are the boundaries of Ukraine, but how do we live together in our political states in the West and in Russia and in China. I guess that's the key truth around that idea. The weakness of that idea, I guess, is it's a little bit hard to really use the term Cold War II when every day we're hearing announcements about NATO and America sending tanks and missiles and mercenary soldiers, contract soldiers, volunteer soldiers to fight, and in some cases to be destroyed and die on the plains of Ukraine. So I guess the story that this is Cold War II, I think, falls down a little bit by the fact that there is now an actual hot fighting war going on, in truth, between Russia and NATO. One in which, indeed, an American naval officer recently, senior serving naval officer recently said how America had prepared the battleground in Ukraine since at least 2014, and it is now seeking to prepare the battleground for its conflict with with China in Taiwan and the Western Pacific. So I think it's a little bit hard to use the idea of Cold War II, although in my next video I'm also going to discuss an idea that I put in a previous podcast, that in a way we're entering the last phase of a long Cold War between Russia and the Anglo-American powers. That the fact that there was never really a proper settlement, a proper equal treaty between the Soviet Union and America, or the West, at the end of the Cold War, has meant that this Cold War has kind of drifted on and has now descended into a hot war. Now, those four versions of the story, I guess, are largely versions of the history of this war that you hear in kind of Western sources, whether they're heavily pro-NATO sources, pro-Ukraine sources, or whether they are lovers of peace and dialogue like Nikolai Petro, who are simply looking for a democratic, an internal resolution of the conflicts in Ukraine first, rather than them spilling out into geopolitical conflict. The next version of the story is a little bit more maybe one of the versions of the story you might hear in Russian sources or pro-Russian sources. And there are such versions of the story, and it's important that people sort of hear them out. And some of the sort of ideas for different framings of this historical narrative of the Russia-NATO-Ukraine war that I'm going to discuss in the next episode try to take on board some of those Russian ideas. But let's just hear this one out, because this is one that does get a bit of traction, particularly the alternative media universe, and that is that this history, that this war can be characterized as an anti-Russia war based in Ukraine, that it is a proxy war against Russia, that it is not really at all about promoting a genuine sense of Ukrainian nationhood or democracy, but it is about defeating Russia by creating a tinderbox and a failed state and a conflict on its borders. And in a way, there are aspects of Vladimir Putin's own descriptions of this conflict that reflect this view that there was a coup in Ukraine in 2014, that Ukraine was being, plugged with weapons and bioweapons, that there was active measures against Russians within Ukraine, prejudiced actions against Russian language and all that sort of thing in Ukraine, and that the West, if you like, wanted to create what I think Putin has even used this term, an anti-Russia on the doorstep of Russia, to create this sort of enemy that Russia would have to deal with one way or the other, in the hope that either it would be defeated or that it would lead to social discontent within Russia that would provoke regime change. So Putin puts that kind of view. The military, affairs commentator Andrei Martynov, who has a YouTube channel, puts this kind of view. You hear this sort of view on places like the Saker and Moon of Alabama and similar sorts of views. And some of these people perhaps unkindly refer to Ukraine as State 404, which refers to when you go to a website and you get error 404, that it simply doesn't work. So there are some truths here that it's certainly true that some American elites really do want to break up Russia, really do want to harm Russia. And the sentiments in Ukraine, the nationalist sentiments, the tensions that emerge in that sort of big brother, little brother relationship have been exploited over decades, really, even going all the way back to giving refuge in America to Stefan Bandera. Those sentiments have been exploited for the interest of American geostrategic power. The shadows of this version of the story, I guess, are that Ukraine is an actor in this too. It's one might refer to Ukraine as a puppet state or a vassal state. But Ukraine is certainly an actor in this process too, and this version of the story of perhaps overplays the extent to which the grand chessboard strategies of Brzezinski and Jake Sullivan, etc., their attempts to use Ukraine to destroy Russia's command of the heartland of the world island, the whole, Halford Mackinder geostrategy idea. It overplays the role of those strategists in really controlling events to the extent that they do, and underplays the extent to which, Ukraine has made a whole lot of decisions itself that have got itself into this mess. And some of those dynamics, which I think are very well described by Nikolai Petro in his book or in the discussions he's had on YouTube and other places, are really essential to this war. Okay, the sixth and final version of this story is that this war is all about the Russian Empire striking back. So this version of the story, to some degree, you can hear this version of the story in Serhii Plokhy's various descriptions of the Lost Kingdom, etc. The continuing presence of an idea of Russian imperialism and Russian nationalism as driving the policies of the Russian Federation. And that this war is all about Vladimir Putin and the circle of sort of security state officials, the people known in Russia as Siloviki, who are officials of the army, the police, the security services, and the various sort of justice kind of ministries, and the politicians who've emerged from those circles, such as, for example, Vladimir Putin, at least in this argument. And this argument is really saying that Putin has a nostalgia for the greatness of the Soviet Union, the greatness of the Russian Empire, and he wants to re-establish it, the humiliation of the 1990s and Russia's decline in geopolitical influence after the end of the Cold War is perceived by this group of people as not just a diminution of their national status, but also a diminution of their power and authority and cultural social status of this Siloviki class. And that the war is then really about conquering Ukraine. It's about that Russian Empire re-establishing itself through control of territories that it should never have really lost back in 1991. And this, I guess, underpins a lot of the Western rhetoric and discussion around this story. It's partly the view put in Serhii Plokhy's books. So in the epilogue to The Lost Kingdom, he writes that will the Russian government and the Russian political and cultural elites accept the loss of Ukraine? By loss of Ukraine, he means the increasing cultural identification of Ukrainians with Ukraine rather than a sort of a Russian world sort of sense of their own identity. This is the essence of the Russian question in its present form. As recent events have shown, the unresolved Russian question threatens peace and stability in Europe and the world in general. The threat is no less serious than the one posed in the 19th and early 20th centuries by the German question, the idea of uniting all the German lands to forge a mighty German empire. And another, in a way, surprising and highly capable proponent of this view is the historian Dominique Lieven, who has not commented a lot in public about the Ukraine situation, but did make a few comments on a YouTube video that he did with Trinity College in Japan that looked at his perspective as a historian of empire and of the Russian Empire and of Russian elites, particularly in the imperial period of the 19th century. He's also the historian of the 1812 War and of Russia's involvement in World War I. He's a brilliant historian. But he refers to Putin and his circle as very much having this characteristic of being Soloviki, whose sense of status and power in the world was threatened by the decline in Russian power, and are seeking to reassert themselves both within their society and internationally, I guess, by invading Ukraine. So the Russian Empire strikes back. Now, the truths of this story, I guess, are that Russia has certainly gone through a process of state strengthening over the last 30, really more particularly since 1999. I mean, in the 1990s, there was this utter collapse of Soviet political, of Russian political and social institutions. It was a true social catastrophe, which I've sort of discussed in some other podcasts. And after Vladimir Putin came to power, there was a genuine sense of rebuilding, of state strengthening, of pushing some of the oligarchs out and rebuilding the army and rebuilding foreign policy and a whole series of things like that. There is a level of contempt, I think, in the Russian elite for the failure of Ukraine to do anything similar. The view that Ukraine is a deeply, deeply corrupt country, that it is simply a failed state, and that its own elites, the Ukrainian elites, played a critical role in sabotaging the Soviet Union and provoking the crisis in the 1990s, and that ever since that the elites have been more focused on enriching themselves. This is the version of the story, enriching themselves through Western connections rather than rebuilding their society, rebuilding their state. And to some degree, it's the view put about Ukrainian statehood in one of the major speeches Vladimir Putin made in the early period of the conflict. So there are some, I guess, truths to that. I guess the shadows of this story is, really, to me, there's an awful lot of projection here, and there's an awful lot of making up of evil intentions when, Russia strengthening its state, rebuilding its economy, rebuilding its sense of national identity after the catastrophe of the 1990s is what you would expect anyone who would have gone through what the 1990s was for Russia would want to do. Any decent political leader would want to do. And to me, there's not really any evidence that Russia is an expansionist or expeditionary imperial power. I think this view tends to see any non-conformity with the Western liberal rules-based order as aberrant, as wrong, if you like. One should either play the gentlemanly game of the Anglo-Americans and play along with their geopolitical strategies, or get the hell out, I think is the underpinning assumptions of this view. So again, I don't think it really accounts for the realities of Russia today. It doesn't really look properly at the perspectives today of Russia and its real interests, its real statehood, its real individuals, its real leaders. It just trades in these caricatures that, you know, Putin's a new Tsar, Putin's a new Stalin, Putin's a new Hitler, and all that sort of thing, and then just applies that to the situation. So there you go. That's the Empire Strikes Back story. Now, I'm not going to say whether any of those 6 stories are right or wrong. I guess you probably get my sense of where I feel some are stronger and weaker. From this, I will add a poll to the YouTube channel after this video comes out to get your views on which of these 6 accounts of the Ukraine war most fit your sense of events. So let me know there, and do leave us a comment below. And I'm going to be back in a couple of days with my next episode that's going to look at 6 more versions of these events, historical narratives that can frame our response to the Russia-NATO-Ukraine war, including 3 that I've sort of come up with myself that I'm going to throw out there and get your feedback on as intelligent citizens of the internet world. So I hope you've liked this. Again, my name's Jeff Rich. This is the Burning Archive channel. I talk about geopolitics, history and culture. I've got some great playlists on and back episodes of the podcast if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any other podcast channel on Russian history, my in reading of the events of the Russia-Ukraine war. So do check those out. And I've also producing some I guess little introductory guides to some really good books that you can read to understand the emerging multipolar world, not just by reading news or watching the latest things on the internet, but by reading some good history books that give you the sense of the bigger, broader sweep of events and how what is happening to us today can be understood within that bigger picture. So do please subscribe to the channel, like and share, leave us a great review, and leave us a comment if you're watching on YouTube. You can also leave an audio message if you like via Anchor and Spotify, and I'd love to hear from listeners. Okay, bye now.